One of the things that will become rapidly evident during the course of my talk is that I am not a scientist. And so I'm a little daunted being in the Vincent Briscoe Lecture series. I'll go further and admit right now that I am what we call a digital immigrant rather than a digital native, meaning I didn't grow up with these tools, I had to learn them. And it's also clear from the title of the talk that I'm not coming here to have an in-depth technical discussion about cybersecurity. But what all of these things I think underscore is what to my mind is one of the most important elements of configuring our society to deal with cybersecurity. And that is a recognition that at bottom, the major challenges of cybersecurity are not technical issues, they are policy and governance issues. All too often, what I've seen over the last several years is that decision makers, whether in the public sector or the private sector, tend to regard questions of cybersecurity or cyber policy as if they are arcane technological questions. Therefore, they have to be remanded over to people who are technically versed in them, and everybody else can wash their hands of it. It's a little similar, I think, to what was the case maybe half a century ago when C.P. Snow wrote about the challenges of bringing science into togetherness with policymaking when the policymakers themselves were not scientists. And how did you get them engaged to understand the scientific dimensions of decisions that were ultimately at the very core of our moral and political values? So that's really the perspective I want to take today, is to look at the issue of cybersecurity from a non-technical perspective, but as one that engages some of the most profound elements of our social, ethical, and legal structure. Let me begin by saying three things about what I think has been transformative about the way in which cyber exists in our modern world. Think about this. 20 years ago, the default position with respect to your private information was that it was private unless you opened it up. If you had personal information, it was generally reposing in your house. Maybe it was in a safety deposit box. Maybe it was in a drawer. The government might require you to furnish some of it to them. You might choose to voluntarily open it up. You might be required by law in some circumstances to make it available. But basically, absent any voluntary or affirmative action, your personal and private information was locked. It was private. It was closed. What many people, I think, fail to recognize in the era of cyber, whatever you have on your laptop or your device or your PC, where increasingly we keep much of our personal and private and intimate data, as soon as you hook it up to the internet, it is wide open. The default position is openness. You have to take affirmative steps in terms of how you manage your settings and controls to determine what you want to close off in a deliberate way. And if you think about that, that's transformative. It means that the presumption has changed from one in which you control opening things to one in which you have to control closing things. So I'm going to contend that's one big change in the way we live now. A second element is, what is public? You know, in the old days, you did things in public and some people saw them, and they might or might not discuss what they saw with other people. And over a period of time, people would forget what they had seen. So there was a kind of natural friction to public behavior. In the world of the internet, we now actually have a level of what is open to the public that far exceeds what Orwell imagined in 1984. After all, Orwell only imagined that we'd have government-operated telescreens in our houses looking at everything we did. He did not imagine we'd live in a world in which everybody in the population was a telescreen. They would take their telephone out, they would film or photograph something that interested them, they would upload it on the internet. Then it would become universally available to almost everybody who had access to the internet. It would never be forgotten. So memory wouldn't fade, it wouldn't evaporate with the passage of time, and it could always be recalled and aggregated together with all the other data that's out there to give somebody a picture of your life, far more granular than anything that even the most avid secret policeman might have envisioned 20 or 30 years ago. That's a huge change. And finally, although we tend to think about the data and the information on the internet in terms of communicative content, more and more of our operational control systems depend upon the internet to actually be executed. So it's not just a question of whether people see what we write or see what we've done, but it can often be whether people can use the internet to actually operate systems, control systems, thermostats, electric grids, transportation systems. And that means there can be a direct physical impact that ensues when there is a breach of cybersecurity. So those are, I think, the transformative elements of our world that really require us to rethink how we approach the question of cybersecurity. And I'm going to argue there are three ways, at least three ways, in which we have to do some rethinking. The first is, how do we secure the architecture of the system? And what I mean by that is, how do we create a system so that people who have a right to control a network are able to actually exercise that control? That means not only security, but it means privacy, because much of our privacy law is built around the concept that when you entrust your information to your bank or to your health provider, that entity or that enterprise has an obligation to preserve that trust and not misuse the information. But that's premised on the assumption that that provider can control its own information and its own network. If they can't, then any promise of confidentiality is a useless promise. So securing the architecture is the first challenge. The second challenge is, how do we deal with the data in the architecture? What rights should people have to control information about them or information that they create, and to manage who gets access and for what purposes? This has always been an issue that we've dealt with, but it is now compounded by the volume and the nature of information that is on the internet. And third, in a global environment where everything that's published is published everywhere, and where there are radically different ideas about what is permissible speech and not what is not permissible speech in various parts of the world, who controls the discourse? Who controls the right of free speech? Is it the lowest common denominator, or is it a freer and more tolerant vision? And so I'd argue that's a third area in which we have to do some careful thinking about what we want as we move forward. So let me begin by reciting a commonplace. We know that the internet began really as a way of simply allowing networking across a lot of different computers and data systems. It is essentially a protocol that allows you to operate across a network of networks. And when it was originally conceived, it was conceived with the assumption that those who participated in the early versions were all well-meaning, they were trusted, many of them knew each other, and the issue of security was not part of the program. The issue was efficiency, clarity, speed, information assurance, and making sure you didn't make mistakes. But it's also clear that in the years since the internet first began, that we've got a much more, I'd say, well-rounded view of the people who are on the internet. We've had crimes committed through the internet for decades now. Frauds where people steal millions of dollars and actually can do an enormous amount of damage. We've seen the theft of intellectual property. We've seen the use of the internet to destroy reputations or to disseminate very private information. And as I'll talk about, we've now seen the internet as an actual means of attacking physical infrastructure in a way that can potentially be quite damaging and could lead to a loss of life or damage to property on a scale of what we saw on September 11th, 2001. So we deal with a domain now which is far different, and in which the nature of the kinds of threats that exist on the internet is much more evident than when the internet was first formed. So with that in mind, now I hope that's not the internet, I hope. With that in mind, I'd like to take each of the three areas I outlined earlier and try to talk about the way in which I think we need to rethink or approach our legal, ethical, and policy principles as they apply. First, let's talk about the architecture, securing the architecture. As I indicated a moment ago, we probably first encountered the issue of cybersecurity with respect to the question of crime and fraud. I remember when I was Secretary of Homeland Security, we had a case in which 40 million credit card numbers were stolen by a gang of organized criminals that was global in its scope and that intercepted wireless transmissions between retail establishments and banks in order to download passwords and credit card numbers. That obviously caused economic damage. It had a negative impact on the trust that people had in the internet as a way of transacting business. It had a serious impact on the enterprises that were attacked through this kind of crime and fraud. But in a way, that was nothing more than a modern, updated variant of what we've always lived with. We've always had fraud, we've always had identity theft. The internet has simply created a more efficient way to accomplish that. So that is perhaps the kind of challenge we've dealt with the most. Is it different in the internet age? Sure it is. In this particular case, the people who were involved were in Eastern Europe. Apprehending them, prosecuting them was very difficult. And it will become increasingly more difficult as the people who run organized criminal enterprises locate themselves in those parts of the world where either there is an unwillingness or an inability to apply robust law enforcement to cybercrimes. So we need to think about the responsibility that we have as nations and what kind of global efforts we can undertake to make sure there is an international enforcement mechanism so we don't have safe havens for cyber criminals. What we've seen at the next level is the theft of intellectual property. And this both involves espionage by state actors aimed at getting our national security secrets, and it involves the theft of business intellectual property and technology that is exported to other parts of the world. Everybody's worried these days about jobs and competitiveness on a global basis, particularly from those parts of the world which are able to produce with cheaper labor. And the question is, how do the more developed and technological countries continue to have vibrant economies? We have always believed that our advantage was the technological cutting-edge research that we bring to all kinds of areas, whether it's medicine, communications, anything you want to think about. But we lose that advantage if the research and the expense and the effort of building that technology can simply be captured, taken overseas, and then used to produce cheaper versions at a lower cost because the new producer didn't do any of the research. That issue of intellectual property and how, again, we deal with that in an environment in which, candidly, some nation states see the theft of intellectual property as a competitive advantage to them. How we deal with that on a global level is a second big challenge. And it may require us to rethink what we do with respect to intellectual property protection and how that integrates with the global trading system. The third and even more recent development is the rise of activism, and ideologically motivated hacktivism, as we call it, as a source of new attacks on all kinds of enterprises, be they governments or private enterprises. You saw in connection with the WikiLeaks episode that there was a group of people, or maybe multiple groups, flying under the banner of the group Anonymous, that went in and tried to degrade or attack institutions that they viewed as negative or hostile to WikiLeaks. PayPal, for example, which didn't want to process donations, was attacked. Other banks were attacked. And we see more and more of this even directed at individuals. And this is an attempt to use, whether it's the theft of confidential and private documents or the disruption of systems, an attempt to use cyberspace as a way of punishing those that you disagree with. And as that develops, more and more we're going to have to be concerned about, is there an inhibition on free speech or an inhibition on freedom of conscience if people are attacked because others don't like what they want to say or what they're thinking. Finally, and I'm going to say this is probably the most serious threat we face, is the use of cyberspace to mount attacks against critical infrastructure. And this is the most dangerous because if these attacks are successful, it's not only damage to reputation. It could mean damage to the water we rely upon to be pure, derailment of trains, threats to aviation security and safety, chemical plants being degraded and emitting toxic chemicals. All of these things are potentially possible if cyberspace is used as a way to invade and destroy or corrupt industrial control systems. Am I making this up? Well, the U.S. Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, gave a speech last week in which he opened the door a little bit to what the defense community knows about what is going on in the world today. He pointed out that in recent period of time, thousands of computers at Saudi Aramco and at a Qatar natural gas facility were invaded by a very sophisticated virus called Shamroon, which actually wiped out many of the critical data fields or corrupted them or otherwise degraded their capability of working. Many of the computers were no longer useful. Imagine if that had led to a shutdown of an important chemical plant that purifies water, or an emission of a toxic cloud, or something of that sort. And as Secretary Panetta pointed out, we are aware of the fact that adversaries are targeting in the United States chemical plants, electricity plants, water plants, and transportation systems in order to put malicious tools in those systems. Have they been successful in actually causing a major loss of life? Not yet. But what is the reason to put this kind of tool in a system if you're not thinking about the possibility of using it? And that, of course, will take us to a much higher level of consequence than we've seen. Again, this raises all kinds of serious legal questions. What I described in the first three scenarios, crime, intellectual property theft, harassment of ideological opponents, those are not normally things we think of as acts of war. And we envision that we would deal with these using traditional tools like law enforcement, the legal system, things of that sort. But if you had an attack on a control system that led to a loss of life or damage to property, it would look very much like a traditional act of war. What would the rules be in terms of how we respond? Would we respond as we would to a physical attack? Would we preempt an attack if we saw one was coming? What happens if the attack comes from another country? Do we have to establish that that country knowingly approved the attack, or is it sufficient to say that that country simply failed to stop it? How do we attribute when in cyberspace now it's possible to move your attack from one hot point to another around the world so that it's very difficult to actually determine where the attack began? And even if we know where the attack began, how do we prove it? And who do we have to prove it to? And do we have to prove it before we respond? How does deterrence work in a world of cyber? In the world of the Cold War, we knew that if a missile was launched from another country at the United States or Great Britain, we would see the launch. There'd be no doubt where it came from. And we had a theory and a doctrine about how we would respond. But how does that work in a world in which there's deniability? Many of you will know that in 2007, Estonia was attacked by Russians. And there was an effort to bring down the country's government and financial cyber structure over a period of a couple of days. When the Russian government was asked, they said, well, these are criminals. We're not involved with it. If you asked Estonians, I think that many of them would say that that was not true. That was a false denial. How would you resolve that issue? Do you need to resolve the issue? And if you are responding, what are the limits of that response? You know, we generally view under the laws of war in the physical realm that there is a restriction on your ability to cause collateral damage. You have to do as little collateral damage to innocent people as possible. How does that work in cyberspace if somebody launches an attack from a cyber location, a server, that also happens to operate all the facilities for the hospitals in a particular city? Does that mean that we can't respond against the server because to take out the server would be to damage all the hospitals? These are consequential issues. And the fact that we have not resolved them and put together a doctrine of cyber war leads to what I would argue is a very unstable situation. One in which it would be very easy for an adversary to miscalculate the consequences of an attack, and all of a sudden we could find ourselves in a conflict situation, not only in cyberspace but in physical space, that nobody had really fully anticipated. I would argue that we are in the domain of cyber war, and particularly as it relates to critical infrastructure, where we were in the 1950s after the nuclear age began. We have a powerful set of weapons. We can envision how they might be used. We have not fully developed a doctrine or articulated a doctrine about how we will deal with these threats in the future. So that is one admittedly quick survey of some of the challenges, legal, ethical, and policy challenges, as they relate to the issue of securing the architecture. But now I want to turn to something else. And this sometimes falls under the rubric of privacy, but I would argue it's really not so much privacy as control of data. Control of the data we create and control of the data that's created about us. Now, we've lived with copyright for a long time, and about 100 and 150 years ago, the law began to develop the concept of intellectual property in what you create. I mean, we actually had copyright that went back further than that, but even your image and the right to control your image became something that the law began to address. And that was just in a primitive age. I mean, it may seem a little bit quaint, but if you go back and look at the American legal history, some of these cases arose where photography was a relatively new thing, and someone would take a photograph of a prominent person and they'd put it in an advertisement to advertise soap or something, and then that person would feel that someone had misappropriated their image. Maybe they felt they should have been paid for it, maybe they just didn't want to be associated with the product. And out of that there developed the doctrine of misappropriation, which began to broaden the original concept of intellectual property to include a certain amount of property right in your own image and your own behavior. Now, of course, we live in a world in which what is out there, what we put out there, and what is put out there about us is vastly greater. First of all, we have not only what we put on our social media and what we publish, which then becomes available ubiquitously, but we have, as I said earlier, what people choose to photograph about us or say about us, or if they meet us and they put information about that meeting on their social media, that is now often available to the public, particularly if they haven't set their privacy at a certain level. What does that mean in terms of how we control all that? And I'll go further. Your car stores a good deal of information about where you are through your GPS, as does your phone and other devices that you use. So locational data about where you are at any given point in time is now vastly increased from what was true 10 or 15 or 20 years ago when we really didn't have anything like that. Metadata, data about what you are looking on the internet, is preserved by the companies, some of the companies that run search engines. And now there's talk about one company that does a well-known search engine that wants to aggregate everything about you. What you search for, what's on your social media, what others say about you, what you've purchased online, and they want to bring it all together in order to market better to you. But think about the vastness of that information. And this, by the way, again, to go back to 1984, this exceeds anything Big Brother in its wildest dreams could have imagined as a collection of a source of data. We haven't fully addressed what this means. We still operate in the US, and I think in Great Britain, as viewing the great conceptual distinction as being public and private. If you're out in public and you do something, that's fair game to anybody. If you're in your own home, it's like the old story, a home is a person's castle, that is private. But when that distinction was formulated centuries ago, again, it was formulated at a time that there was a natural friction or erosion of public behavior. Not everybody saw it, not everybody talked about it, not everybody remembered it, it was not accessible to most people, and over time, unless it was a truly notorious act in public, it was forgotten. But now in a world where everything is seen, everything is remembered, and everything is immediately accessible to everybody else, we do have to ask the question, is public the same thing? Does our expectation about how long things are retained and how accessible they are, is that need to change now, and does that need to change in terms of what you can do with things that are public behavior in a world where there is no friction? This is a very complicated issue. I can tell you in the U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court has just begun to start to ask questions about this. And they've done it in the context of what the government can do. The question is, do you need a warrant in order to collect information about where someone is driven using GPS and locational data, or where a person has made telephone calls using cell phone data, or what videos show about someone when they're ubiquitously all over a city. One of the arguments made is, well, listen, you're in public. It's no different than it was 100 years ago. If the police wanted to follow you, they could follow you around in public places and they could record everything on a piece of paper. Why is this different? And yet the court has at least raised the question whether the sheer volume and the analytical capability to merge and analyze all this data has actually become a qualitative difference. It's not just that the police can do something better than they used to do, they can do something different. On the other hand, you could make the argument, is there a constitutional right or a human right to have the police be stupid or have their capabilities deliberately limited, as long as what they're doing is relying on things that are still out in the open? Again, very hard and difficult questions. But I'll go further than that. That's just the government. What about the private sector? When you do have a commercial institution or something that operates a search function, and it does collect all this data, and remember, everything is open now once you've logged on, what are the restrictions that ought to be placed on this? It would be odd to say the government is more restricted in what it can look at and do in order to protect you from crime and terrorism, but if private enterprises want to sell you things, they can peer into every nook and cranny of your life in order to get a picture of what kind of person you are. And what's particularly complicated is often people voluntarily put that data out there. But again, you can ask the question, do they fully appreciate the dimensions of what they have opened up in a world in which so much of what occurs is not obvious? One way to think about it is this way. Human beings are hardwired to deal with other human beings. When you interact with somebody, when you choose to tell them something, most often if you do it in person, you have a set of tools you bring to deciding whether to trust that person or not. Obviously there's the conversation, but you watch them, you look at their body language, you look at what they're wearing and ask yourself whether there's something about that that's inconsistent with what they're saying. There may be things that in their gestures or things about their biography that will give you additional insight into trustworthiness. Almost all of those tools are not available on the internet. So you're trying to decide whether to trust people, and yet most of the human tools that allow you to make that evaluation are unavailable. There's an old cartoon in the New Yorker magazine, this goes back maybe many years. It shows an old style PC, and there are two dogs sitting in front of the PC. And one dog says to the other dog, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And actually that's true, but in many ways that's frightening. We have not fully addressed this issue. I know the Europeans are looking at this now, and the French have recently come out with some strong views about this. But I think we're going to need to take a hard look at what the default position is with respect to a lot of this data. And by the way, here's the third kind of odd dimension to this. What about the government's right to be safe with respect to what the private sector does with government data? There's a big move afoot from an efficiency standpoint to move government data onto the cloud, which basically means to collect it all in servers that will be managed by private enterprise, supposedly under strict security rules. But imagine that you take the data mining and data analytics that are being used in the commercial space and apply it to the cloud. And then that gives the private sector the ability to see what government is doing based on the millions of interactions of government officials that might give you some real insights into decision making that could affect the stock market, or might be of value to a foreign power trying to gain intelligence about what our policies are, or might even help to identify a military campaign in a way that would help an enemy to frustrate it. Again, as governments look to put more and more data on the cloud and to work with the private sector, these are issues that need to be thought through from a fundamental security standpoint. And finally, just as I've talked about the importance of making sure we think through the question of how we secure the internet and how we protect our right to control data and what that ought to be, there is the question of what shouldn't be controlled. After all, one of the things about the internet that people have applauded is the ability that we have to communicate ideas and principles and values around the world, so that we can instantly learn about some very important and inspiring developments around the world. You know, the story of this 14-year-old Pakistani girl, Malala, who was shot. I mean, her story is now known all over the internet and what she stood for. And likewise, there are parts of the world where the ability to get into the internet has spurred uprisings against dictators. But we also know there are certain countries who, when you start to talk about internet security, they get very excited and they go, yeah, that's great. And the first thing we're going to do is secure ourselves against bad ideas and democracy. And then to be a little bit more, to drill a little bit deeper, there are parts of the world where some of the things that people say that are offensive and insensitive and maybe sacrilegious not only cause people to get upset, but actually cause people to commit acts of violence. And in a world in which it's very easy to step on toes, and you wind up seeing not only flags being burned, but Molotov cocktails being thrown because someone didn't like a cartoon or they didn't like a YouTube video, does the internet create a new set of responsibilities about policing whether inflammatory material is disseminated in a global environment? Now, again, just a little bit of U.S. legal doctrine. The rule in the U.S. has always been, under our freedom of speech, which is probably more on the freedom side than in many countries, that there is no such thing as the heckler's veto. Meaning the fact that I say something and you don't like it, you're not liking it and you're reacting doesn't mean I have to shut up. We don't give people the right to censor simply by being outraged. But again, remember, that's a doctrine that developed in a relatively homogeneous society with an overarching set of legal principles. In a globe where there are many people who fundamentally don't agree with that, should there be a heckler's veto? Now, I'm going to be clear, I don't think there should be. But I will tell you, this is a matter that is a subject of very robust debate. There are, I'd say, a significant number of countries in the world that believe certain speech ought to be off limits because it is upsetting, and who say because it's on the internet and it's available to everybody, you've now got to control the speech in your own country. And that, I think, is going to pose a very, very fundamental issue for our free society. Are we going to let ourselves be censored by parts of the world where, when they don't like what you say, they try to kill you? And that would be a perverse irony if the internet became a tool of speech suppression rather than speech facilitation. So I haven't given you any answers in this lecture, but I hope I've raised a lot of questions. I would say it's an exciting time to be thinking about these issues, because there is really a revolution in the way our life is being conducted, and it impinges upon fundamental values and fundamental aspects of how we live as individuals, not merely as societies. But what it will take, and I know this is an institution that is very strongly scientifically oriented, is to break down, and I'm going to quote, not quote, but I'm going to reference C.P. Snow, is to break down the division between the cultures of science and technology and those that are kind of the liberal arts. Because it's going to be important for the people who are not technological to understand that the technologies are creating fundamentally ethical policy and governance challenges that will have to be met and addressed by society as a whole. So with that, I'll be happy to take some questions.